Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you today about new currencies in procurement. We have seen a lot of developments over the last couple of months and years, how the world is changing. And if you just reflect on what's going on, it's really amazing how many different new challenges and situations procurement and operations leaders need to deal with. If you just think about it, in the next 5 years, 20% of the global goods exports will move to a different country. If you think about the drop of commodity prices that we had in the last 3 years, right? Take the example of paper pulp going down in 2020 by 40%, increasing this year to 150%. Think about the disruptions that we've seen in the supply chain now for multi-months. And we actually at McKinsey, we analyzed whether these disruptions will actually continue or increase. And it's pretty obvious that it's actually increasing. It's not just one driver, it's many drivers that has led to this. What does this mean for procurement? The consequences are pretty obvious. Procurement leaders need to think differently about what matters and where they create value. In the past, life was relatively easy, right? Relatively easy. The one thing that matters most is what have you spent last year in your P&L and what are you going to spend next year, net savings. That was the currency that really mattered. If you realize what's now going on is that many procurement leaders realize we need to actually place our jetons on different areas where we need to actually create value. Just to give you a little bit of an example, I remember when COVID started, I talked to the CPO of a big automotive company and asked him, so how do you deal with the current volatility in the market? You remember that was the time when the oil price was at 0 for a day. You remember that? So he said, no, we are not responsible for this in procurement. We are measuring everything excluding the market effects. If you talk to him today, he says, this is obviously a new world. What matters now is not only gross savings in terms of market outperformance, cost avoidance, and all of the stuff. You remember this term cost avoidance was a no-go, right? How much this has changed. But there's other currencies as well which become more and more relevant. One really important currency, in particular in the last couple of months, has been the diversification of your supplier portfolio, right? In the past, it was more or less a question of global arbitrage. Do we actually have how much best cost country, low cost country? This has changed significantly in the view. Another important currency, nothing new for you, but it's obvious, is the CO2. The dual, we call it the dual emission. I remember I spoke a couple of months ago to one of my clients in the railway industry, and the responsible infrastructure capex leader said, you know what our challenge is? If we are a public company, the only thing that matters so far is savings, or price. That's the key selection criteria for suppliers. Now, if you give me win-win ideas, it's great if I save something and I reduce CO2, but how do I deal with the trade-offs, right? Where I need to invest, how much worse is one CO2 gram savings in euros or US dollars? And the last one is really the supply chain flexibility. I think what really matters now much more is the ability to not only predict and anticipate, but react fast. And procurement companies will be, and leaders are much more measured on how quickly can you actually react to boundary changes. Now, these are the different currencies that matter now. How much do they matter? A lot. This is an example of a consumer company where we calculated how much do you traditionally, in terms of contribution, save per year. It was the typical 2 to 3%. And here you see how much they now need to actually deal with. Inflation because of energy cost increases, supply chain flexibility. Just imagine if they, so to say, avoid 2% loss in sales and recover that because they have better availability. And of course, other things like CO2 and the value of CO2. The factor is easily 10, 15% value that procurement needs to actually address higher than it was actually in the past. So the currencies increase and the opportunity space increases. Now the question obviously is, what do you actually do to actually improve and deal with these new value dimensions? And that's where, like you would do this when you're in the casino, you need a royal flush. You need something that actually helps you to address all of these new currencies. And we will talk a little bit about what are these new levers that can actually unlock the value. One big topic is what we call the 360 resilience check. 360 means across the entire supply chain, including sales, including internal supply chain activities, understanding what are the issues and what needs to be dealt with. The second big lever and value contribution, we would call it, is thinking differently about your supplier archetypes. In the past, it was all about global, local suppliers, but what matters now is how risky is it? Which suppliers are hit most by potential inflation? Do we have potential bankruptcy cases in the supply chain, and where are they? So that's the second one. The third one, and we talked about this at DBW a lot in the past, was the operating models have changed, that procurement needs to move to a much more agile structure. What now comes up is actually not only an agile pool, as we call it, and we will talk a bit what it means, but a resilience pool, meaning dedicated people who actually now deal with all of this inflation, new currency, and implications on capabilities. The fourth one, which is a very important value contributor, is the entire question on how you move from a spend manager to a margin manager. Right? In the past, procurement was responsible for supplier data, category data, and the implications on procurement and production, but now it matters much more what the overall margin management is. Right? And how do you actually make sure you, for example, forecast and forward price increases to your customers. And the last one is basically the times of a traditional spend cube are a little bit over. Right? What you now need a much more dynamic model that allows you to really think continuously what are the changes in your supply chain and what does it actually mean for your cost position. Now let's go a little bit more into the details. The 360-degree resilience check. What we've seen in the past, of course, was the traditional annual typical update of your category strategy, right? The elements are supplier strategy, contracting, and so on. And this now needs to move to a completely different perspective. Let me give you one example. Many of my clients always, when I ask them, how do you think about category strategies and how often do you do them? They say, yeah, we update once a year. I remember one of my clients said it's always April. April is the month of category update. We do a category strategy update, supplier strategy, product strategy, contracting, demand management. This is changing significantly. Doing once a year a category strategy is no longer the answer. You need not only a higher frequency, but you need other elements. Price availability analysis, sustainability perspectives, the supplier resilience monitor, what's going on month by month. We call it the localization of the supply chain. So where do we actually go for a short-term or local sourcing? Where do we go for global? And of course, much more important now, where do we have substitutes? Where are we flexible to say if this ingredient, if your consumer company is no longer available, how do we deal with alternatives? So there's a big shift on the entire way how you think about your category strategy, and that's why this resilience 360-degree check is an important element as a value contribution. The second thing we talked about and I mentioned is the introduction of different supplier archetypes. And that moves from the classical dual single source global local supplier question to a dynamic resilience archetype. What does it mean? You probably remember the times when the typical KPI that procurement people were asked about was, what's your share of best cost country suppliers? Or where do we have the risk of monopolic situation and therefore we need to look for alternatives? If you think what happens now and matters now is completely other dimensions, right? And we call it different archetypes. In particular in the inflation context, we differentiate 3 different archetypes which matter. The inflation protected supplier, the inflation throughput supplier, and the inflation sandwich supplier. What does it mean? The protected one is pretty easy. The costs will actually be relatively stable over time, but the prices of the suppliers will increase, so it's a relatively safe life, right? If you think about a typical railway company, it's the best example, right? You buy locomotives and infrastructure, you depreciate over 50 years. what happens today or tomorrow on the cost doesn't matter so much, but you can increase prices on the customer side as needed based on inflation. So that's protected against inflation. Then there are the suppliers, very often they are commodity suppliers who are actually in the world of index-based contracts. They have cost increases, but they at the same time also increase their prices. So they're actually quite well positioned to forward or throughput inflation situations. And then the third one is the group you need to watch out for. We call it the sandwich suppliers. What happens is costs go up, but your prices are fixed. And this is the risky group, right? We all see it these days with gas trading utilities. These are the first ones where we can see it every day in the press. But that's the big risk you need to actually watch out for in the future. In particular, you need to watch out for where are these along your supply chain. To give you an illustrative example, this is a typical structure of a transformer. We took an energy example of a typical utility. They buy transformers. Of course, they are these days all the time in the press. And a typical transformer manufacturer has 670 suppliers, and below that on tier 2, tier 3, 6,000 suppliers. Now you can easily imagine what's happening, right? If some of the 6,200 suppliers have a potential supply risk, maybe even because they are sandwiched, maybe even a complete bankruptcy risk, this is something that you will actually suddenly see and you can't get the entire transformer. So understanding which of these suppliers after your first tier 1, which ones in the tier 2, tier 3 are the real bulk risk is the important dimension. We, for example, analyzed this in this case at McKinsey, and we realized in this case there's about 35 highly interconnected. That means a supplier in tier 2 delivers many of your tier 1s, right? Or even 310 who actually deliver at least some. These are the bulk risks that you have in your supply chain. If you don't see that and forecast, analyze, you run a big risk in the future. So that's the entire topic of the new way on supplier archetypes. The third big topic, and we talked about this in DPW, I think also last year, was the trend in the organizational setup, right? Traditionally, procurement organizations have a structure of category, dedicated people, and then some maybe cross-cutting people for methods and tools. And we already back then said we need to actually move, and we see many moving to an agile structure where you actually allocate people to categories wherever it's needed. We now see a lot of companies who say this is not only an agile structure we actually need a resilient structure. What does this actually mean in practice? In the past, you had strategic buyers and operational buyers. Typically, it's a 30-70 split. Some of my clients sometimes argue they have 80% strategic buyers. I'm always interested to see these guys who have 80% strategic, because I guess then they have no strategic buyers. But anyway, let's assume 30-70 is the current split. What happens in the future and these days is two things. One is you obviously need to reduce the operational buyers, right? Being more efficient, automation, using digital tools, reduce this to 40%. And then the strategic pool, by the way, the term strategic actually even doesn't make sense these days, right? If in the current life, why do I need a strategic buyer? I need creative buyers, right? Or I need subject matter experts who really understand the market dimensions. And what you also need these days, very often, and many invest into this, is a dedicated team that understands how to think about resilience. What does this mean? How do I actually measure inflation? How do I actually incentivize my organization to actually be flexible, right? The net P&L impact doesn't matter anymore, but it's an end-to-end profit management. So there's a different type of buyers that you need. There's a different, so to say, also way how you need to orchestrate them, because not everyone who's currently a category buyer will immediately become a creative resilience buyer or so. That's why an agile structure with a pool is actually a very important element. So this change in the org model really matters. What also matters is the type of tools that you need, right? It's interesting how this is currently changing. The typical development in inflationary environment, and we've seen this in the 1970s already. It happened last year with, this is the example of stainless steel, right? I think everyone talks about price increases, not in steel, right? In steel we have already come down. But you see the phases, right? There is the pre-inflation phase, there's the shock phase, the plateau where it's more or less stable, and then it actually is a deflation. This will also happen, of course, with other commodities. And what you see here is a little bit how the tools that you need are changing, right? In the past, you need, in pre-inflation, you need predictions, hedging policies. What you need now in many situations where we are in the shock, for example, energy prices, you need dynamic clean sheets, right? It doesn't make sense to calculate once a year the cost structure of your suppliers. You need dynamic modeling. You also need different supply sources alternatives, the typical China +1, right? Wherever you have a Chinese supplier, you need a second alternative. And in the future, you will actually need different tools. We can already forecast in a couple of months, and everyone hopes, obviously, it's rather sooner than later. We need tools to claw back inflation. We need tools to understand what has been the demand-supply changes in the industry, in the supply industry, and thereby we predict how prices are changing. So the entire skill set and tool set that this resilience pool will need is actually also changing. Let me talk a little bit about number 4, the spend to margin manager. To give you a little bit a sense, what happens is that in the past, procurement was really focusing very often on managing the spend, understanding, transparency. The typical structure looks from a procurement world. You have your tier 1, your tier 2, you understand the different categories, how they're interlinked, having a good spend cube around this. Many have invested into this. What you need now is actually something different. What you need to have is a margin manager. What does it mean is, if certain things change in your supply chain, for example, supply shortages or price increases, limited availability of raw material, you need to think through what does this mean for my offering. I, for example, have worked a lot in the past with a food manufacturer. And the first thing that happened already a couple of months ago was the oil shortage. So they had to change specifications saying certain products we actually use different oils or no oils at all. Now they have the challenges that certain products are produced in areas where the supply chain logistics flow is a little bit disrupted. So thinking about what does this mean from a procurement world on manufacturing, on logistics, even on sales, is actually a completely different end-to-end perspective, and that's what we mean with the margin management view. And the last one is, what does it actually mean for the technology side? Obviously, of course, an important discussion today in this group. What you've seen already in the past is that there was a spend cube enhancement going beyond the classical spend cube dimensions, and now we need a much more dynamic model. To give you an example how we think about this at McKinsey or in our Orpheus company is, in the past you had the classical dimensions, supplier information, category information, and product, right? Easy words, 3 dimensions, not easy, but at least possible to manage. This has already enhanced. Cross-ops data stack was the key term 1 or 2 years ago, right? Linking it to production BOM, to stock level, inventory management, inventory data, of course, delivery data, and all of that stuff. Now, it's actually even getting more tricky, because what you now need is a real dynamic supply model, meaning if certain things get more volatile, how do I actually think differently? In the past, you had basically a once defined product configuration, right? When a car model was introduced in the market, you define the production structure, where do you allocate your just-in-time delivery. Now, with the semiconductor shortage, you suddenly need to adjust production portfolio, right? So procurement drives the actual dynamic influence. You need to be able to connect the data and understand what this actually means. So this gives you a little bit of a sense on what does it actually mean in terms of the implications for the digital side. So let me summarize a little bit what we've seen. So we think that because of the new currencies, there's a significantly different value dimension pool, or we call it new currencies, because of these boundary condition changes that procurement leaders need to deal with. And there's basically the 5 key dimensions that actually will help you to actually address these new currencies or improve them. The 360 degrees resilience check, the different supplier archetypes. You remember the sandwich supplier versus inflation protected. Moving to an agile pool, including resilience, people, and new tools. then moving from a spend manager to a margin manager, and last but not least, the technology implications in terms of moving from a spend cube to a dynamic supply model. So this hopefully summarizes a little bit what we see in the world going on in terms of new currency and what procurement can do. So that's a little bit my food for thought speech, and then now I'm looking forward to any questions or input.